What is up, everybody? Welcome to a very special edition of the DFS MVP podcast, a showdown Super Bowl edition. I'm your host, TJ Hernandez, the director of DFS at 4for4.com, with our showdown guru, Matt Savoca. What's up, buddy? How you doing?
I'm doing great. 23 weeks up, 23 weeks down. Here we go. Super Bowl is looking fantastic. I mean, a lot of narratives here, a lot of ways this game could go. Excited to break it down, and a showdown version of the DFS MVP. Very excited for it.
Yeah, I don't dabble in showdown much, so I'm gonna just kind of let Matt lead the way on this and tell us how we could crush this this slate. If you have been on the 4for4 website, you know we have a ton of betting content up already. The betting dudes have been crushing it. Connor Allen has a great Super Bowl breakdown, very, very detailed, and Matt has his showdown breakdown up as well, which goes into detail of showdown analysis, but we're gonna cover that here as well. And if you haven't signed up for the DFS subscription, you want to get access to that showdown article, it's only $6.99. Only one slate left, but get in there, click around, see how you like the site, get you warmed up for next season. And best ball's already rocking, so I mean we're not going to take too much time off this offseason, but
yes, sir.
Let's get right into it, Matt. 49ers are the visiting team, obviously neutral site for the Super Bowl, but 49ers are technically the visitors, favored by 24.75 point projection for the Niners. Chiefs as underdogs, 22.75 with a game total of 47.5. Let's talk about just kind of a macro view of these offenses. Very different offenses. Obviously, Brock Purdy's been hyper efficient this year. Offense runs through CMC, but they have a plethora of weapons over there. KC a little different, obviously, not very deep. Patrick Mahomes, worst season of his career, still pretty damn good. Everything runs through Kelsey, Pacheco, and obviously Rashee Rice has been ascending. But let's talk about the macro real quick. What do you see from these two teams in terms of the pace of these offenses?
I think we could see very varied approaches is the short answer here. And that goes into why there's a huge range of outcomes for this game overall. For those of you who aren't subscribed over at 4for4.com, I take a very systematic data science-based approach, but then I also explore narratives before we get into my projection for the ownership and rostership for DraftKings and FanDuel for every single island game. So what I want to do for you guys in showdown slates is make sure that we kind of start out and then zoom in. So one of these ways that I do that is I start with the projected game environment, and just looking at this from the wide angle, it's actually kind of tough. We know where both teams want to go, but with the way that they spread out the ball, really both teams here, this slate runs 10 deep in terms of the number of actual players who could legitimately end up being the top scoring overall player and the optimal captain play. That makes it kind of exciting if you're a multi-lineup GPP guy, but if you're looking for who's obviously the right answer, yeah, sure, there's one running back who I can think of is the most obvious, but really there's 10 players who, when we look at the range of outcomes here, it's easy to see how they got to the optimal score. Now, if I look at these two teams, Patrick Mahomes has obviously had a hard season by his standards. This team still throws at one of the highest passing rates in neutral game scripts, one of the fastest teams in neutral game scripts. It just hasn't led to the type of production and efficiency that we're used to. In fact, they're under 2.0 touchdowns per game on offense over the last month and over the course of the season here. Meanwhile, San Francisco, around the slowest team in the NFL in neutral game scripts, and passing at a rate basically like they're right around the Tennessee Titans this year in neutral game scripts in terms of pass rate, and still they're top 3 in offensive touchdowns per game. Their quarterback is top 3 in fantasy points per drop back, despite not having really any rushing upside to speak of. The efficiency level has been off the charts, and we'll get into the quarterbacks and how they've played this season. But overall, these teams look like two teams who, one is still actually trying to find its identity with Patrick Mahomes just kind of getting them there, and the other that has found the strongest identity in the league offensively.
Yeah, even not even from a showdown perspective, like when we're just trying to analyze games, like if this would have been a top game to stack in DFS or something like that in a full slate. These are always really fun games for me, I think, because as you mentioned, you chart out the team passing rates and the team's pace, and we see KC up in the top right corner, San Francisco down the bottom left corner. So
Yeah.
when you've got those that much of a contrast, I think it's really fun because, like you said, it really does open up the range of outcomes and let you be, I think, a little more comfortable with doing some contrarian things, just because things can go so differently. Before we get into those specific quarterback matchups that you mentioned, do you see anything from either O line or D line that stands out as a strength or a weakness for either of these teams?
Yeah, obviously, Kansas City not having full strength on the offensive line is a breaking point we have seen before. And who can forget the Tampa Bay San Francisco Super Bowl where Patrick Mahomes was running for his life? I don't think that's a great comparison here. I think this offensive line is in better shape. And I think Mahomes and this offense is built around quick passing around the inside much better than that team. But ultimately, both of these teams, actually, if they had one shared weakness, it would be their overall offensive line. They have some strong players, but they don't have a strong unit. And one thing we do see with offensive line, it tends to be a weak link system, meaning that if you get to a certain breaking point or have one bad player that is exploitable by the Nick Bosas of the world, that's when things can run into trouble. Now, do I think that's the most likely outcome here? No, I think the Kansas City offense is going to be able to operate. But as I go down narrative street in the beginning here, I do think sort of like that Rams Patriots Super Bowl from just a few years ago, whereas two offenses who were very capable, but neither showed up, is definitely in that range of outcomes for the floor of this game.
Yeah, and that's interesting too, because obviously if there are some pass protection issues on both sides, things can slow down. Because if you look at something like schedule adjusted fantasy points, the weaknesses on the defenses are actually against running backs. So I mean, we
Right.
we'll get into this later, but we could see a lot of running back usage in this game, I think. But again, we'll dive into that once we get into the actual breakdown of the players that we're liking. Let's talk about the quarterbacks specifically before we get there, because in all of your showdown articles, you do a very detailed quarterback analysis. And let's start with Brock Purdy, because I mean, obviously his efficiency metrics are through the roof. But he, as the it's Super Bowl, so everyone's talking about everything. Gets a lot of heat. People want to say that he's a system quarterback and all that. But from a DFS perspective, what do we see from him and what he produces for us?
Honestly, he just had the better season compared to the other quarterback. And I know Patrick Mahomes is the biggest name in the sport, the biggest name at the position, and he can win games on his own. No one has to tell you that. But Purdy had an incredibly efficient season. And, media hoopla and the MVP voting aside, since that just came out and there's all these narratives being spun, the guy was number one in EPA per game. In the true drive success rate metric, the metric that I created for 4 that basically looks at your ability to turn a drive into a touchdown, adjusted for sample size so that we can look at it starting at the beginning of the season, top 5 in the NFL. He fell off from a completion percentage over expected standpoint, but there are a couple of reasons we could kind of explain that away. Some tough matchups, some injuries. Still, we're talking about well above average in the 3 main efficiency advanced metrics that we look for in quarterback play. And it's resulted in production. The top offensive touchdowns per game, top 3 in passing touchdowns per game. And yet we know Mahomes on a 1-game sample can outscore the man, because that's just what he's able to do. We just it's hard to bet against the guy on the other side, but just looking at the season overall, and even the last month, I looked at just December and on, Purdy still has the better efficiency metrics.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned in the article, Mahomes hasn't scored 20 fantasy points since week 12. He went through that really rough stretch, like a 6-week stretch leading up to week 14. We saw him get it going a little bit against the Bills, and they played arguably the best defense in the league last week or last round in the Ravens. But what have you seen from Mahomes since that week 14? They bounced back a little bit. Obviously, a lot more dink and dunk than we're used to from him. Everything pretty much goes through Kelsey and Rashee Rice. But I mean, what stands out as a way for him to succeed in this spot?
Well, it's really the balance of the offense. The fact that Isiah Pacheco has been such a reliable force, really in the passing game and in the rushing game. We've seen him with
Yeah.
2 games already in the playoffs with 24 rushing attempts. And, we're talking about a player who could get 30 opportunities here in this game. And it's not like Mahomes was terrible in these advanced metrics that we look at. Yes, he was down towards league average in EPA per game, towards league average completion percentage over expected, but Mahomes' job is to try to score touchdowns. And there were some game script reasons for why you could say things went wrong, Kadarius Toney, but Patrick Mahomes is still in the top 12 in true drive success rate. Yeah. There are still plenty of metrics like true passer rating and true QBR that indicate that at any moment there's that 2020, 2021 type explosion. I do think that the offense scoring 3 touchdowns is a kind of low probability outcome now. That's weird to say because we know in a 1-game sample it can happen. But if I had to put a number on it, it's probably like less than 20%, maybe less than 25% that this team scores 3 offensive touchdowns, which is weird to say. They can win scoring, 20, 22, 25 points.
Yeah, Niners 4th in pass defense DVOA and 7th in scheduled adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. So on paper, the matchup already tough for offense, as you mentioned, hasn't been up to the Chiefs' standards that we're used to. In your article, after you break down the quarterbacks, you go through the core plays and auxiliary plays. Again, not necessarily making picks, just going through their usage. Start on the 49er side. I mean, we know it's, CMC, he's going to get as much work as he can handle, not going to come off the field. Like, it's going to be a surprise if another running back even gets a touch. What do we see from him? Again, obviously he's going to get a ton of usage, but how do we think he gets used in this game? Is it a lot of running? Is it heavy passing game? Or do we think they're going to lean a little bit more on their pass catching weapons?
I kind of feel like this could be game over if they can just hand the ball off to McCaffrey and the bottom 7 run defense of the Kansas City Chiefs, who, by the way, have played very, very well of late, can't cover McCaffrey, because that's a possibility here.
Yeah.
And if he's getting 5 yards of pop, 5-6 yards every time he touches the ball, that's it. They're just going to bleed the clock. Mahomes is going to have to play hero ball in a way that he has been unable to with this version of the Chiefs offense. And that's the reason we see McCaffrey well above everyone in terms of projection and in terms of opportunity value, which we measure by expected fantasy points. And we look at a 3-game sample for all of these players. He's in a tier of his own, unsurprisingly. And if you want to look at the San Francisco offense overall, I think this is a great offense to be playing showdown DFS because so much of the offensive production goes to those top 5 players.
Yeah.
And we'll get to the auxiliary options in a minute, but there's basically no auxiliary options that I feel comfortable with on San Francisco because so much production is in that top 5. So obviously McCaffrey is the best one, but after that, just bunch up as many as your roster can afford.
Yeah, we if you look at the 4 for 4 projections, we have Debo and Brandon Aiyuk projected almost identical right now. George Kittle is pretty close. The matchup is kind of good all around. Aiyuk has a little higher weighted opportunity rating. It just always like it feels like we're throwing darts. We're trying to pick between these 3 pass catchers. Is there anything usage wise that has stood out over the last few weeks with Aiyuk, Samuel, and Kittle?
Kittle is still that player who continuously outplays his projection. But in terms of Kansas City's defense, they're number 3 in schedule adjusted fantasy points against wide receivers and number 15 against tight ends. So they're not bad, but it's enough where it might change my opinion, because if you look at all teams this season and the schedule adjusted fantasy points page goes to the end of the regular season, understandably so.
Yep.
Kansas City is 3rd best when you add up wide receivers and tight ends. So the only weakness I'm seeing is over the middle. But again, we're bearing the lead because they were 26th against running backs and they're playing Christian McCaffrey.
Yeah.
If that works for San Francisco, you're playing the who scores a touchdown game with these 3.
For sure.
I definitely like Kittle on paper of the 3, but if you told me the other 2 had great games, not surprised. The one area that Kansas City has most improved this season by far is in that secondary. They can blitz and they can keep teams from getting huge yak plays. I just saw a great article, I believe it was on NFL.com using next gen stats. The Chiefs are the only defense that has negative yards after catch over expected, basically yards after catch less than expected while blitzing, which is an impressive thing to do since there's less people in the secondary.
If they come blitz heavy on Sunday, do you see does that stand out as a Debo game to you?
It does. I think, as I said in the article, that they're going to manufacture touches for Debo Samuel. I think it's a near lock that he gets 10 touches.
Yeah.
If that means he needs jet sweeps or he needs, plays where he's just in the backfield, they'll find a way to get him the ball. And obviously, the check down options for Brock Purdy are the most insane check down options we've ever seen on a football field together. So I hate to go down narrative street with Kyle Shanahan again, but don't overthink this. If the team blitzes, get the ball to Kittle, get the ball to Christian McCaffrey, or, misdirect with plays like Juszczyk. And I mentioned him as a player who actually could be on the field a lot and is a good dart throw as well in the article. Obviously, if that's an auxiliary piece, they just have so many ways to beat you. If I had to go with one, it's still Kittle after McCaffrey.
There's not much to speak of 49ers auxiliary options. I mean, everyone else, like, we could legit see, no one else get more than one touch. Juwan Jennings gets used to block a ton. There's been a lot of talk this playoffs about how great of a blocker he has been. Elijah Mitchell, he got that, he did luck into a touchdown in the playoffs, but I mean, it's just hard to imagine anyone doing much work for the Niners. Have you seen anything in the expected fantasy point or the usage metrics that suggest that one of these guys could be a contrarian hero?
No. I mentioned Juszczyk. I do think that if you're playing super, super large field DFS, just because it's one game, this game gets so much attention, the tournaments get to be so big, and you sometimes need to be that contrarian. A player like Elijah Mitchell starts to make sense, but not because we expect the game to go in that direction, but because unexpected things happen on a football field, and we know the reasons why Elijah Mitchell suddenly ends up with 20 touches. Do I want to see that version of the Super Bowl? Absolutely not. But if you want to talk about ceiling potential 1% outcomes, that's definitely in there. Ray McLeod is more of a special teams player, and honestly, his usage has been shrinking. I really mentioned Juszczyk because this team seems like they may have to go with some heavier personnel to counter the blitzing of the Kansas City Chiefs. And if they do that, Juszczyk ends up on the field a little bit more. Kittle seems more involved. That's probably the way I'm going. Again, all of these players are underneath, in terms of projection, the Kansas City Chiefs auxiliary players we're yet to mention.
Yeah, 471,000 entries in the DraftKings Millionaire. I mean, it's going to be such a, like, the how hard it is to not be duped is going to be crazy. I mean, obviously you'd never hope for an injury. You never like want to root for an injury. Like, Elijah Mitchell just makes sense. Like, if CMC gets hurt, like, it's Elijah Mitchell. If one of the pass catchers get hurt, like, the other two just pick up the slack. If CMC goes down or misses a couple drives, Elijah Mitchell could obviously be a big difference maker. On the Chiefs, little more concentrated. They only really have three guys that they're giving the ball too much: Rashee Rice, Isiah Pacheco, and Travis Kelce. What have you seen from the usage specifically between Kelce and Rashee Rice? Because as you mentioned, Isiah Pacheco has been getting a lot of work in the past game too. But the splits with Kelce and Rice and how their target shares look this playoff run.
Yeah, so Kelce's been the player who's been incredibly productive, but if you look at opportunity value, where they're getting the ball on the field, when they're getting it, the air yards, the amount of targets, it's actually Rashee Rice who has almost 5 expected fantasy points per game more than Travis Kelce. Mm-hmm. It kind of speaks to, if we're still doing the breakout receiver model as we do during the regular season at 4 for 4, we might be looking at Rashee Rice as a possible breakout player here. Again, not the most fantastic matchup, top 5 in DVOA, San Francisco's defense is, but you're looking at schedule adjusted fantasy points. This team in San Francisco actually doesn't look as impressive as I thought they would. Mm-hmm. Again, adding up wide receivers and tight ends, team is 19th. in schedule adjusted fantasy points. I was kind of shocked. Now, one thing that they do well is they tend to limit the fantasy scoring of the quarterback. They were seventh best against the quarterback position. And that's kind of a weird discrepancy. Only a couple teams had that discrepancy this year. Off the top of my head, I believe it was like New England, the Giants as well. Teams that tend to have the possibility of one or two massive games. And I ultimately think that's what happens here. I think two of Pacheco, Rice, and Kelsey end up getting close to their ceiling performance, and I'm trying to get them. And honestly, looking at it right now, I'm kind of deprioritizing Mahomes.
Yeah. I mean, if is it just because is it salary based that you're deprioritizing him, or is it just that you don't think that he's going to necessarily go off with three guys with him?
I'll say this flat out. If you want to play any of these top 10 options as your captain, go for it. In any type of tournament, anyone from McCaffrey down to Kittle is viable. Sure. But yeah, it comes down to the salary. If I'm going to go up there, I just want to get the guaranteed opportunity value that I'm getting with the running backs. And of course, it could happen. I just said the ceiling game for Mahomes absolutely happens here. Could happen here. But for me, I'd rather take the security and safety of the guaranteed touches of Pacheco or McCaffrey, who each could see 30 total opportunities in this game if I'm going to pay up in that salary.
If Pacheco doesn't reach that 30 touch range, or if Kelsey or Rice don't have as big a games as we think, what have you seen from the secondary options in the Chiefs offense? And they got a lot of them. Like these are guys that definitely can hit, unlike the 49ers. Justin Watson, Mecole Hardman's playing time's been going up a bit. MVS can always get a deep one. Any of these guys pop to you right now?
I'm just thinking of the 4for4 Discord because every single game we're in there, and obviously the Chiefs are in these island games a lot. So we're talking about these auxiliary weapons all season long. And there's a couple of our very active users who are just despising these Chiefs showdown slates because it's honestly very tough. You've got Watson, Hardman, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Noah Gray, who both obviously in backup roles could be highly involved in these Andy Reid Super Bowl trickery moments we know could happen. And then Richie James, I think I mentioned him a couple times in the article. I think he could actually be a difference maker out of the slot. Obviously, he's used more in special teams. We have him 6th of 6 in these auxiliary weapons in terms of our projections. But he's actually one that I kind of like, especially if the team is limiting Mecole Hardman. Hardman is still the one, if you look at a 3-game sample, has the highest expected fantasy points per game. But I still think there's a huge amount of variability here. Long story short, I don't trust it. Watson actually has the higher projection on 4for4 this week.
Have we seen anything? Is there any shot McKinnon plays this week?
I do think he's going to be active.
That could throw a wrench in it.
I think there's a possibility that Sky Moore, Jerick McKinnon, and Kadarius Toney are all active. If I had to take a chance with one of them, I can't believe I'm saying this on the last show of the year. Like I'm gonna have to live with this like all off season possibly, but I think Kadarius Toney is a fine dart play if he plays.
I mean, again, 471,000 people in the middle. You got to do something wild.
And we have seen moments where he was open and available, but for various reasons did not execute. Yeah, which means that there was manufactured opportunity for him when he played. And it's fun to go down narrative street from other Super Bowls, as I've already done earlier in the show, but you remember the Percy Harvin Super Bowl where he didn't play essentially all year for the Russell Wilson-led Seahawks, and he was a huge difference maker in that win against the Broncos. I believe that was here in New York City, like a decade ago. So it's a possibility. They're all low probability, but sure. Adding to the fun.
I mean, they're going to save you some salary too. What's Kadarius Toney at on DK? He's 2,100 for a captain position. I mean, what's that 10? 2,100. I don't think you're playing him a captain, but 1,400 salary. Like, I mean, why not? Before we get into the specific plays and builds, its salary and ownership, I want to remind everybody about Prize Picks. Prize Picks is daily fantasy sports made easy. Go to prizepicks.com/DFS MVP. Use code DFS MVP for a first deposit match up to $100. We have a 4-player pick'em today that would 10x your money. You talked about Kyle Juszczyk, less than 3.5 receiving yards. Patrick Mahomes, more than 0.5 interceptions. Christian McCaffrey, more than 90.5 rushing yards. Isiah Pacheco, more than 68.5 rushing yards. As we said, we like the rushing offenses in this game. That 4-player pick'em will 10x your money if and when it hits. Don't forget to go to prizepicks.com/DFSMVP. Use code DFSMVP for a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks is daily fantasy sports made easy. All right, let's get into the actual showdown analysis of this. We talked through the player and matchup breakdowns. Let's start with the captain plays. You made a list of the obvious captain plays: Christian McCaffrey, Brock Purdy, both quarterbacks, Isiah Pacheco on the other side. Those are guys that are always going to be in the mix, the primary running backs, especially on offenses like this, and the primary quarterbacks. Obviously going to be quite expensive for those guys as well. McCaffrey up at 18K for captain, Mahomes 15.9, Purdy at 15K, and Pacheco is actually only 12K for a captain, which is super interesting. So from the obvious captain options, MVP options, who stands out to you here? Obviously salary is a huge consideration. We're not just going to slam dunk Christian McCaffrey.
I think it's safe to say that he's kind of a slam dunk nonetheless, especially against Kansas City's defense, which on paper looks like it is much weaker against the run. I think Christian McCaffrey in a traditional running back role, running at 5 yards a carry, pretty much, as I said, pretty much makes this a win for San Francisco. And one thing that I do on Discord as we get up to game time, because obviously injuries, not so much in the Super Bowl, but late injury news can sometimes impact our projections. I post one final chart that kind of shows the trend line of whether it's sort of, as you pay up in salary, should we expect more points per dollar at the captain position, or should we expect less? And one really interesting aspect about this slate in particular that we haven't really had in a while is that it's pretty much flat.
Yeah, I was just going to say that.
It kind of leans me towards paying up a little bit, but not necessarily for McCaffrey. If McCaffrey scores 30 points, he's the optimal captain, obviously. But even Pacheco, Rashee Rice, players who we know could get a huge amount of their team's opportunity value, are really interesting to me. And I will say, Pacheco out-touching Christian McCaffrey straight up is a possibility here. And if you're getting that much of a discount, I think I'll take it from a game theory perspective, even if on paper McCaffrey's the better play.
Yeah, we currently don't have anyone projected for over 15% ownership showdown on DK. If let's say you do pay all the way up for McCaffrey, what is a ownership number that if you open up your tournament and he is above that, would you be disappointed in seeing?
At captain?
Yeah,
you're going to get into tournaments where, especially the single entries, where it gets wildly different. Like I wouldn't be surprised if we saw 30% ownership in some single entry spots, because again, like I talked about, paying up for opportunity value is simply a safe DFS strategy that we want when we can be contrarian elsewhere, even on a 1-game slate. I do think that I was surprised to see, as we ran these ownership projections, that it's so flat, but I do understand it, again, because just the sheer number of possible captains when you look at the range of outcomes. But again, every time I start talking about a different range of outcomes, I just think back to, like, CMC could just be the hammer in this game, scoring 30 points, just running the ball straight up the gut.
Yeah, and some smaller field stuff, because like he probably is the dude that gets outweighted ownership. Would you say you might be a little less inclined to be super heavy on him compared to larger field stuff where he might only be in that 15% range?
I'm actually going to say no. I'm going to say that if I have a single entry lineup that I really like the looks of that has CMC at captain, I would not be afraid. I would just fire away. Sure, I think that it makes sense as the ownership starts to go up that the easiest way to be contrarian is to simply not play that player. But the upside really is there. Actually, I just ran floor and ceiling projections as we started, and very few outcomes had McCaffrey at 30 points, which might change my tune as we get closer to the game. In fact, the quarterbacks had slightly higher ceilings, but Narrative Street tells me that maybe there's something that the Sims don't know.
Yeah, what number are you looking for from McCaffrey if you capped him? We probably need to be above 25, right? 25 PK points.
Yeah, and his ceiling score hit right around 28. I'd rather him sit around that 29-30 number.
Yeah.
That would make me feel really good about choosing him, and we know he can get there. I think the short answer is we have three players in McCaffrey, Pacheco, and I'm going to say actually Mahomes, who, if everything breaks right, 35 points is still on the table, even if we haven't seen it in a few weeks or months.
Yeah, definitely. As you mentioned a little bit earlier, like all of the main guys are captain options, especially in large field stuff. Like these dudes all just get a lot of usage. But you highlighted three players that you like as captain options, specifically both tight ends and Deebo Samuel. Talk about why you like playing tight ends in the captain on this slate.
It has to do with the fact that both teams are excellent against wide receivers. Their overall secondary grades are strong, and then if you look at their positional defensive metrics, it just simply looks like their wide receiver defense has been stronger all season. It's been the biggest area of improvement for the Kansas City defense by far, and that's why it's leaning me towards George Kittle if I'm thinking of one of these San Francisco passing attack options. And honestly, I don't think George Kittle gets enough credit for how good of a season he had. Second among tight ends in average depth of target, but third in yards after the catch, meaning that not only is he getting the ball further downfield, he's turning that into more expected yards after. Third in fantasy points per route run, number one in yards per route run. Yeah, he's not going to get the ball as much as a player who is the clear number one option on his team, but he gets the ball in such advantageous positions, and is such a good overall player that, again, if you told me he was the X factor here, not a surprise at all.
Yeah. Do you think there's any chance that he gets some steam at captain? I mean, his captain's salary on DK is only 9,600 compared to 15,300 for Kelsey. Do you have any worry that people just click on that super cheap captain number and try to get all the other studs in their lineup?
Not so much, just because there's so many other strong options here. Honestly, when you look at a per dollar standpoint, the best value in this tier looks like Pacheco or Rice. It's a little bit more in salary. I would say of the sub 10K captains, yeah, he probably looks like by far the best. But we have 6 post 10K who look like fantastic options as well that are going to obviously be very popular as well.
I mean, we have a ceiling projection for Kelsey of 26, a ceiling projection for George Kittle of 25.4, and you're getting almost a 6K discount on captain if you play Kittle. So, I mean, that seems like something that we should definitely be paying attention to, especially if he is going to come in around 10%, sub 10% captain ownership. That's a pretty crazy discrepancy in salary for players that are projecting so close together. The other player that we kind of talked about a little bit with his tough wide receiver matchup is Deebo Samuel. What does he do to get there as a captain?
Well, he could end up exploiting Kansas City's porous run defense, which is always a plus when you're adding those guaranteed touches. He's also been hyper efficient when he's been in the game over the course of the playoffs. Obviously, he missed a large part of that divisional round matchup. I believe he caught 8 of 9 targets last week, 100% route participation rate. I think he's doing okay in terms of that injury. And again, his specific ways that he tends to exploit defenses, especially with his gadget usage, lines up so well with what Kansas City tends to struggle with the most on defense that I want to highlight him over Brandon Aiyuk. I do think that Aiyuk does look like the better maybe end zone target if you're just thinking of like who's going to get just straight up goal line catches. But I think the creativity of Kyle Shanahan is what ultimately helps Samuel get over the top. As I said, I think he's going to have 10 manufactured touches in this game, whereas you can't say that for Aiyuk.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people are going to look at Debo and CMC and say, if he does get those manufactured touches, maybe that kind of cannibalizes CMC because they're rushing. I actually think Debo and CMC could get there together in this game. I think they could combine for that much usage, just those two, because of this matchup. Before we get into the actual build strategies and the narratives we want to be building around, if you're playing any of these pass catchers as your captain, is there any scenario where you're not rostering their quarterback as a flex?
I think it's okay in San Francisco's case, especially because we know that if the offense gets close to the goal line, they're not going to have a problem just going McCaffrey 3 straight plays from 1st and 5 at the 5, and they'll do that multiple times, especially with the idea of, hey, if we don't get it on 1st or 2nd down, that clock keeps bleeding, longer time with Mahomes off the field, and to me, Purdy doesn't have to get there for 2 or maybe even 3 of his top options. I do think if I'm playing Kelsey or Rice, I'm stacking with Mahomes.
Sure. Before we get into those narratives, the game flow scenarios, any of the kicker or defenses stand out to you as players that we want on our rosters?
They are in the subpar category, but playable.
Sure.
Both the kickers and the defenses. I don't see either of these quarterbacks having a super mistake-filled day. I do see lack of execution being the reason they lose. That seems like a very reasonable outcome for either of these quarterbacks. But in terms of median price, in terms of projection per dollar, and medium just overall projection, the Chiefs defense is literally right smack in the middle of the slate. And the 49ers defense is slightly below average, with the kickers just slightly ahead of the average projection. I would say they're floor boosters more than anything else. I don't think there's a huge ceiling there.
Kickers priced pretty much the same. Chiefs defense is $1,000 cheaper than the Niners on DK, so that'll factor into the decision a little bit too. Speaking of the kickers, if they are usable, it's probably going to be in a spot where the offenses go off. What is a way to maximize a build if just the main characters on both teams ball? If this is a high scoring contest, how do you like building around that type of scenario?
I do think that Mahomes and Rice or Mahomes Kelsey stack with one of those auxiliary options is the first place I'm going there. And then again, this is kind of what I go into after all of this data analysis over the course of every single article. Then I start to go down narrative street and I say, okay, what are the different ways this game ends up playing? And we know that with so much star power here, we could have Mahomes and Kelsey, Mahomes and Rice, Mahomes and both of them, or we flip the build and say that Pacheco ends up with that 25-30 opportunity game. We then pair him with someone like Harrison Butker to boost our floor, and then add 2 of those auxiliary options, those myriad auxiliary options. If you're looking at our projections, you might go with Justin Watson or Mecole Hardman. If you're looking at points per dollar, you might go with a player like Richie James. Again, what I'm trying to do is maximize the number of San Francisco core players I can get in a lineup, and then just saying goodnight and playing Chiefs on the other side, because it's just so low probability. I'm actually trying to avoid the Jennings, the Mitchells, the Juszczyks, and the McLeods, unless I'm in those super, super large field tournaments we've been talking about.
What would you say that if we're building around a shootout scenario, that's probably the toughest build to leave a big chunk of salary on the table to try to be unique?
So tough. So tough. And that's probably where I end up going to the players who look, quote unquote, less valuable on a point per dollar basis, where I know that their ceiling is still 30 points. Deebo Samuel, Brock Purdy, Brandon Aiyuk, and yes, Travis Kelce. I knew it was weird as I put less obvious captain plays and put Travis Kelce in there, but that's really what the overall projections say.
For sure.
Again, but we know what the production has been like. Yeah,
I mean,
just
that salary's
out
no
of his
joke
mind.
though. 15-3 captain, that's going to be tough when you got Mahomes $600 more, or the other quarterback $300 less. So yeah, he's sandwiched between the quarterbacks, which people like playing in the captain. So that might keep him pretty low into the captain spot. We talked a lot about how both these quarterbacks have pretty tough matchups, and if that plays out, could be a really low scoring contest. And this is probably a scenario where we could figure out a way to leave a big chunk of salary on the table and get unique.
Mhm.
But specifically, what are the players or the way we want to stack this game if it is a low scoring one?
Yeah, then it suddenly becomes very easy, like you said, to leave salary because we're probably only playing one of McCaffrey and Pacheco. And I might be so bold to say I'm okay playing none of Mahomes and Purdy. Now, I'm probably playing one, but I'm okay playing none in scenarios where they just simply don't get it done. That leaves me still tons of those tier 1B core players that we've been talking about, the Debo Samuels, the Brandon Ayuks, and George Kittle, who could all have huge games. San Francisco was 7th best in schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed to the quarterback position. Kansas City was a little bit more towards league average at 14th. Both teams have completely shut down star quarterbacks to make them truly unnecessary for DFS purposes. We just saw Kansas City do it with Lamar Jackson.
Yep.
It's certainly possible they can do it with Brock Purdy. And this San Francisco defense has often made quarterbacks look silly. Are they more vulnerable than I think some people realize? Yes. But again, in this scenario, suddenly I'm playing a running back. I'm probably playing the kicker. I'm probably playing a defense. And again, I'm still able to get to a bunch of those players in the core options before I have to throw those darts with the Kansas City six, as I call them: Watson, Hardman, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Gray, MVS, and Richie James.
Yeah, I mean, we just saw the Chiefs in a 17-10 game in the championship. Do you think the floor, total scoring floor, is lower than that for this game? Could you see like a 13-10 game play out?
I do think that is pretty low probability.
Yeah.
I
think
do think that
17-10 is probably like the floor.
these are still really good offensive play callers and really strong quarterbacks that probably execute enough. The Kansas City offense has been bad, but we're still talking about 1.6 offensive touchdowns per game. That's league average. That's not, the sky is falling. It's just not Mahomesian, as I said in the article.
The last way you like to build, and obviously these aren't the only three ways, but these are the three ways that you really like to build. And I think this is the most interesting one because I think a lot of people are really going to have a hard time wrapping their head around this. And it's just one of the teams like completely falling apart and collapsing. Which side do you think is more likely to do that, and how would you build around that scenario?
I think with just the level of playoff and Super Bowl experience of the Kansas City Chiefs and Patrick Mahomes, you have to say that the more likely quarterback to have that kind of execution breakdown would be Brock Purdy.
Yeah.
Again, going down narrative street with Kyle Shanahan, but we kind of saw it with Matt Ryan in his MVP season when Shanahan was the coordinator of the NFC champion Falcons. Matt Ryan clearly got in his head in the second half of that game. And the play calling also didn't do that team a whole lot of favors. We could obviously see this team, this coach, which is in a very different scenario, learn from those mistakes and out execute their past. At the same time, I do think both defenses could end up making one of these teams just look silly in terms of what they planned on doing. Again, gonna go just having fun with Super Bowl narrative street. I remember Sean McVay in his loss to that Patriots team, I believe 5 years ago, said that he overthought his Super Bowl game plan. He took too long and his offensive game plan overcomplicated things. That's a possibility here. Sure. And they get away from the easy plan, which I think is running just straight up the gut with Christian McCaffrey. And that leads to just less scoring, less overall plays, and just less overall fantasy production. I still don't think the defenses suddenly become an optimal captain play if we're just looking at just what happens on a per dollar standpoint of the values here, but I do think it leaves the door open for multiple of these, just so many auxiliary options to suddenly float towards the top. If we're looking at the 4-for-4 projections, the top 5 would be Noah Gray, Kyle Juszczyk, Justin Watson, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, and Richie James.
Is there any way you play both defenses in the same lineup?
Am I playing with 500,000 other people? Yeah. Like I'll throw 2 defenses in a lineup and one of 150. Sure,
it's gonna look pretty gross, but I mean, right? Like if you're throwing 150 out there, why not? Before we get out of here, any general thoughts on? Did anything stand out to you in the ownership, or is there anything specific that you'd be paying attention to in ownership? If we already talked about CMC, but if we're playing something like the Millie versus a smaller single entry contest.
I do want to say that just a reminder that even in these 1-game slates, that the minute you start to get to 2 and 3 player combos, you're starting to eliminate a significant amount of the field.
Yeah.
Yes, Christian McCaffrey is going to be in every other lineup if you look over the entire all slates. But once you start combining him with some 1 or 2 player combos that are unorthodox, you suddenly differentiated yourself enough. Yeah, you're going to have to go off the board when you're playing 500,000 people, but don't think that you have to be completely contrarian at every position in order to win, even in the Super Bowl slate. With a player like McCaffrey, who you know is going to be so popular, I often in these 1-game slates will lean in or lean all the way out, and sometimes do that based on different tournaments. So I'll have one set of 150 where I'll go all the way way ahead of the pack, and then I'll be way off of it the other way in another tournament. I do think that at the end of the day here, you're going to see wild discrepancies. Don't be surprised if you see McCaffrey well over 50% captain in your small field. Don't be surprised if you get into a random, 100 field tournament and there's like Mahomes way up there for some reason. You're just going to see weird variance because it's so many people playing.
If you're maxing the Millie, how many lineups do we have with 0 CMC?
If I'm maxing the Millie, 0 CMC, 90.
Okay. I like it. All right.
That's so bold. I don't know if I'd actually do that, but I could see a scenario where that happens.
Yeah, that's fire. I mean, 471,000 people. As I mentioned, I don't play a lot of Showdown, but there's no action until August, so I'm probably just going to empty the DraftKings clip on this slate, and hopefully you guys will hear from me after Sunday. But that does it for the season. Matt, thank you for everything. Thank you for the Showdown analysis, to the listeners, to the subscribers. We appreciate it so much. Can't wait to be back with you guys next season. Hope you guys have a profitable Super Bowl. Hope you guys have a safe Super Bowl. As I mentioned, I mean, best ball's already starting, so we're probably not going to be away for too long. As always, if you want to give back to the show, easiest thing you could do is follow us, rate and review on your favorite podcast platform. Like the video here, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, and check us out on the Twitters/X. Matt's at Draftaholic. 4for4 is at 4for4 Football. I'm at TJ Hernandez. We'll see you guys next season.